How do you know which training zone you're in when you're doing your endurance training? Many athletes have heard of polarized training, you've got 80-20 running, and many athletes know that to develop your endurance performance, you often have to do a combination of high intensity endurance training and low intensity endurance training. But how do you guide or know which training zone you're in when performing this training? I mean, you could use heart rate, but it's so susceptible to other factors such as the environment, heat, if you've taken a load of caffeine beforehand, so it's a bit unreliable. So is there something else we could potentially use? Well, I'm Dr. Phil Price. I'm a senior lecturer in strength and conditioning and biomechanics at St Mary's University, and I am the host of the Progress Theory. And I'm also the author of The Science of Hybrid Training, which you can get from Amazon. The link is below. And in this video, I'm going to talk about how you can identify training zones using ventilatory thresholds, and why I use something called the torque test to try and estimate which training zone I'm in when doing endurance training or coaching. Now, if you're familiar with exercise science or exercise physiology, you probably have seen this graph before. Now, this is an example of an athlete who has measured their blood lactate during doing something like an incremental step test. So you do bouts of endurance training over a set period of time, and then with each step you increase the intensity, and with each step after it you measure your lactate to determine what your blood lactate concentration is. And as the intensity increase, you can start to see an increase in blood lactate concentration. And from these data we can plot this particular curve, and what we often see are two areas where there's a deflection point. We've got two parts of the line where we start to see a particular change, i.e. blood lactate concentration starts to increase somewhat in some way. And thinking broadly, we often label these threshold 1 and threshold 2. Now, this isn't like your usual exercise science book. There isn't like a distinct point where it starts to go up. It's usually a particular area where we start to see a gradient change. And a number of different physiological changes happen during these points. And because of that, these thresholds are often called a variety of different things because these changes happen around these particular areas. Now, the difference you can often see with threshold 1 and threshold 2 is that at threshold 1, blood lactate concentration starts to increase. And then once you get to threshold 2, you start to see a real exponential increase. So we want to know what happens at these points. And also, why on this particular graph, why have I called them ventilatory thresholds? You know, this is a graph that shows blood lactate concentration. What does this have to do with the ventilatory system? Now, as we pass threshold 1, we see this increase in blood lactate concentration. And because of that, we see the ventilatory rate start to increase as well. This is because of the increased levels of CO2 caused by the increased breakdown of the increasing amount of blood lactate. And this is through lactate dissociation. Through this process, we get an increased number of hydrogen ions from the breakdown of lactate, and they bind to bicarbonate, which in turn produces water and CO2. Thus, CO2 increases and minute ventilation starts to increase to try and expel this through expiration. So in short, breathing rate increases because we're trying to expel this increase in CO2. Now, if we go back to our graph and look at ventilatory threshold 2, we get this exponential increase in blood lactate concentration, and this threshold, or this area, or this point, is often labelled as respiratory compensation point. Now, the mechanisms behind ventilatory threshold 2 aren't as well understood as in compared to ventilatory threshold 1, but we think similar mechanisms are involved, and that kind of makes sense. You know, as we pass a ventilatory threshold 2, blood lactate concentration increases exponentially, so this process, which generates a lot of CO2, is going to increase exponentially as well. You know, using the same process that broke down lactate increases excessive CO2, and the body has to get rid of that. So in doing so, breathing rates become much faster to the point of exercise-induced hyperventilation. Also on top of this, there has been some research to suggest that chemoreceptors that increase ventilation are also involved. Okay, so we understand why these two threshold points might increase the amount of breathing rate, but what does this have to do with a torque test? I just want to take a minute to thank our sponsors for this video, Human24. Human24 is a lifestyle company that provides amazing supplements to really help with your concentration and help with performance with your day. And I think they're perfect for if you're an athlete or like me, a researcher where I have to have high levels of concentration to be able to do deep work throughout the day. Now, there are 3 products I particularly love. Firstly, upon waking, I take hydrate. Be able to get electrolytes in me after dehydrating during the night. I also use hydrate straight after any training that I might do, particularly on a day like this when it's really hot and sunny. 90 minutes after waking, I take Rise, which is their caffeine product to really help me with my concentration during my morning deep work. Then in the afternoon, I use Flow to again help me with my deep work, but this time using nootropics and using a caffeine-free blend. As you can see, these aren't just products that I've just ordered. These are well-used products because I use them every day and I really highly recommend them. So if you head to human24.com, that's HMN24.com, and use the code PHIL10, you'll be able to get 10% off. Okay, back to it. Now, the talk test is a self-regulatory method which many use during their endurance training. So what you do is you say a sentence out loud, and your ability to say these words on top of your perceived breathlessness determines or helps you estimate which training zone you're in based on ventilatory thresholds. Now, if we go back to the graph, we can see that we use a 3-zone method here. So we've got 3 zones. We've got the moderate domain, we've got the heavy domain, and we've got the severe domain. So let's start with the moderate. Now, this zone is where most people do their low intensity endurance training, more like their what's popular as zone 2. This zone is before the first ventilatory threshold. And because breathing frequency is yet to increase significantly, you should be able to say a full sentence without getting too breathless. Now, when I'm doing my low intensity endurance training, I test the intensity that I'm in by saying the following quote. "The function of man is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days trying to prolong them. I shall use my time." Now, this is a popular passage from Jack London, who is an author, and it was used in the recent Bond film, No Time to Die. There was nothing special about this quote or passage in terms of testing, although the quote itself is very personal to me. However, for me, I believe it's long enough to truly test if I am in the right zone, or certainly before ventilatory threshold 1. Now, people tend to do their zone 2 or their low intensity endurance training way too intensely. And they think they're in the moderate domain or zone, but really they're actually training in the heavy zone. Now, this passage or quote is long enough that I should be able to say the whole thing without getting too breathless. Maybe it's a little too long, but it really does stop me going too intense. You know, there's 3 sentences there. I should be able to say the whole thing without being too breathless. If I am, I start to slow down. Okay, zone 2, the heavy zone. We've passed threshold 1 and we're between ventilatory threshold 1 and threshold 2. Now, in this zone, blood lactate concentration does start to increase, but it has the ability to stabilize. Therefore, breathing rate increases, but not to the point of hyperventilation. Now, because of this, I can estimate if I'm in the heavy zone by saying a much smaller sentence. So usually around 5 words long. Now, I personally break the heavy zone into 2 sections, and many people do if they use a 5-zone model, for example. So my sections of the heavy domain are just after threshold 1 and just before threshold 2. So the 2 ends of the heavy domain spectrum. So I should be able to say more words without getting breathless just after threshold 1 and less words just before threshold 2. So just after ventilatory threshold 1, I say, "The function of man is to live, not to exist." However, if I want to train just before ventilatory threshold 2, I say, "I shall use my time." Again, I should be able to say these words without feeling too breathless. And if I feel I'm not achieving this, I then adjust the intensity accordingly. Now, the severe zone. In the severe zone, CO2 is produced excessively and your breathing rate increases significantly. Therefore, in this case, you will only be able to say 1, maybe 2 words without getting breathless. Now, when you're training this hard, you probably don't care which words you use, but it's a good estimation as to where exactly you are. If you can only say 1, maybe 2 words, you're training pretty hard, you're probably in that severe zone. Finally, just to add, the talk test is a method that is excellent to use when you don't have much physiological data to help you estimate which training zone you're in. You use descriptors to help you estimate based on breathing rates which training zone you're in, based on how well you can speak out loud without getting too breathless. But these are very much estimations. If you have the ability to do lactate testing as well, that's great because you can still get more data to provide a bit more confidence to know which training zone you're in. But if you don't, the talk test is a great method to use. Have you used the talk test before? You can use whatever quote you'd like. Use something that's personal to you. If you have experience using it, let me know in the comments. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.